Okay, so here are some questions on the ADAS model.
This is an awesome question which tests a lot of skills here. So first of all, we have to draw the ADAS model, and we are told that we start with a level of GDP that's below our potential. So what kind of a gap is that? So we have to draw that gap, and then we have to interpret what happens when the Americans have lower income. When they have less income, they're going to buy less from us. So our exports will decrease. Okay, so the interpretation here is that we start with a recessionary gap, then the aggregate demand is going to decrease since we're going to have less exports. So there's going to be less spending on our goods and services. So you would draw your GDP market with AD and AS. You find your equilibrium. The Y1 here is your actual GDP. It's a good idea to write actual underneath so that you're not confused. Now you're told that the level of GDP or your actual is below potential. So this should be less than potential, which means potential should be more. It should be somewhere here. So you draw your vertical line, your Y star, and it's a good idea to write potential underneath so that you're not confused. Sometimes you see LRAS. Again, go with the notation that your teacher uses or you see in the book. Sometimes they differ a little bit, but not too much. Okay. If AD decreases, what you do is you shift it to the left, right? So you draw your arrows, you draw a new curve, make sure you label everything, and you see that the price drops and the GDP also drops. Did the American recession help reduce the gap? No, actually the gap is even wider. So we were already in a recessionary gap and we got a further reduction in GDP.
So here we're asked to show what happens to the GDP market in the short run because of a particular event, and we're going to explain our logic. So when you get these questions on the GDP market, we would start by drawing that market, ADAS. We have our equilibrium. We label it P1, Y1 because we're expecting this equilibrium to change. Okay. So here the event is that workers go on strike for higher pay. So what that means is now employers are going to have to pay more to their employees if they want them to continue working. And that's going to increase their cost of production. So what happens is firms will not have as many workers, or they will not be able to hire as many workers if we think that they have a fixed amount of spending money. And that's going to reduce the amount of supply in the economy or in the GDP market. So it's going to shift the AS curve to the left. If we do that, we get a new AS curve, we get a new equilibrium, a new level of real GDP, and a new price level. And then we always want to conclude at the end to show, well, what was the effect of that on the price level and the real GDP? Well, we see here the price level increased and the real GDP went down. So we would just state that as a conclusion to the question. Here's another example. Okay, so another event. We would start with the same picture, but the effect or the shift will be different. What would happen if the minimum wage is revoked? So if they just completely removed the minimum wage, okay, let's say in the province of Quebec, how would that affect the GDP and the price level? Well, I'll leave that up to you to practice. There's going to be an effect, so figure out which curve is shifting and in which direction. And then you would also conclude what happens to the equilibrium price and equilibrium GDP. Okay, so again, think about what is being affected here. Okay, is this affecting production? Is it affecting demand? Shift the correct curve in the correct direction and then conclude.
Another event is if the interest rate goes up. So again, you draw your GDP market with your AD and AS. Notice that in some books or some teachers use SRAS instead of AS. It's the same thing. And you have to understand what the interest rate does to the economy, right? So you need to know what is the interest rate, okay? So interest rate is what people have to pay on their loans, right? So it is the cost of borrowing. If borrowing is more expensive, people are gonna borrow less than before. And if they borrow less, they're gonna spend less. So the household consumption and the firm's investment go down. Whenever you see CNI, what it means is that we are talking about the aggregate expenditure. So you write the formula to show your thinking process. And because the C and I are going down, the AE as a whole is going down. So because there's less spending in the economy, there's going to be less demand. So the demand curve is going to shift to the left. So you show your arrows, you draw a new one, you do the labeling, and you find the new equilibrium corresponding to the price and the GDP. So if you compare P1 and P2, you see that it's going down, and Y1, Y2, it's going down also. So you write that down. The equilibrium price level decreases, the equilibrium GDP also decreases. This is how you should do this on a test. You should label everything, show the arrows, show the dotted lines, and the most important thing is your logic. So here, by saying that this is related to borrowing, you show your understanding of what the interest rate is. And another one for you, if the Canadian dollar becomes weaker, what's going to happen to the GDP market, right? So I'm going to let you do the graph and make sure you do the explanation. So what is the logic here? Your tip here is that this is also going to affect the AD, so this is the demand shifter. So you would have to write your AE formula and show which one goes up or down and how, and then show it in a diagram, and finally what happens to the equilibrium price and the equilibrium GDP.